Welcome to Press TV Spotlight. I'm Marzia Hashemi. Thanks so much for being with us. Israel's best heroes. This is what the individual responsible for Zionist prison services and national security has said about the IOF soldiers' raping of Palestinian prisoners. And perhaps Ben-Gvir is right, since we know the moral compass of the Zionists is the opposite of normal human beings. Heroes for the regime would mean those who can commit the most heinous crimes. It might be difficult, though, to decide, because you have Zionist soldiers who have burnt babies alive, to those who've cut up kids into pieces. You have those who have disconnected newborns from incubators and left them to die, to those who have killed civilians and then rolled over them in front of their children. Which one gets the Hero Award from the most immoral army in the world? Well, it's a toss-up. Stay with me on this spotlight as we look at the latest crimes of the regime. I'd like to welcome my guests to this program. Out of Vancouver, Charlotte Cates, International Coordinator, Samadoun Palestinian Prisoner Solidarity Network. And Saad Nemr, out of Ramallah, Professor of Political Science at Verzet University. Well, thank you both for being with me. I'm going to start it off with Charlotte in Vancouver. Charlotte, now the type of crimes that have been committed during this American-Israeli genocide is really beyond belief. From starvation to immolation, nothing seems to be off limits for the Zionist regime and its supporters. Do you believe that there are any red lines that the regime would not cross when related to the Palestinian population?
It's very clear that when we're talking about a genocide taking place, we're talking about really an attempt to exterminate the Palestinian people physically, socially, culturally, and in every other way. And so what we've seen time and time again is anything that one might think is a red line has simply been rolled right past by the Zionist occupation forces. So, just yesterday we witnessed a massacre where a U.S.-provided bomb was dropped on over 100 Palestinian civilians as they prayed morning prayers as they were sheltering in a school where they had been forced to seek refuge. And they were massacred. And this is not a red line for the Zionists. What we saw in the videos and the numerous reports and the numerous testimonies from Sidi Taman, where we are hearing from Palestinian prisoner after Palestinian prisoner who have been subjected to the most horrific forms of torture and abuse at the hands of Zionist captors, from gang rape and sexual assault to horrific torture, electroshock torture, people being bound to beds 24/7, being force-fed and denied food, people's eardrums being split through noise torture, just a real celebration of torture. And then we've seen this actually, celebrated in the streets by Zionist rioters who were outraged at even the thought of a modicum of accountability, even just to please the International Criminal Court for these torturers and rapists and abusers. The only kind of red line the Zionists recognize is that will be imposed upon them externally by the resistance.
Okay, well, Saad, after footage of the soldiers taking a Palestinian prisoner to rape surfaced, the U.S. responded by saying the reports are horrific and should be fully investigated by the Israeli government. What does this mean exactly? What does it mean that they are saying that the regime who's committing genocide is allowed to investigate itself after committing so many crimes, and especially if we look at the last 10 months?
Well, good evening for you, Ms. Hashemi, and to your guest as well, and all your viewers.
Thank you.
I'll start with tell you something. I've spent myself in Israeli prison for 8 years, and I thought for some moment that I've seen it all. But apparently, after the 7th of October, this is totally another world totally. From the testimony of the Palestinian prisoners who have been released, from some of the reports for the lawyers who have been able to visit some of the prisoners, and also from the reports that we are hearing every once in a while from either Haaretz newspaper or other organizations in Israel who, sometimes they release some of these news. It is horrible, and I think that we never ever seen such a thing, not only in Palestine during the last 50 years of war, of occupation, but also around the world. I don't think that this kind of things, people try to compare the Israeli prisons, and especially Sidi Timan, which is a prison in the desert, near to Gaza, where most of the people in Gaza were put in, and it is the worst in the world. And they try to compare it with Guantanamo, but apparently this is even worse than Guantanamo, and that will make also, what happened in Abu Ghraib in Iraq is a mere joke in comparison. We can't even describe the saddest and the fascist mentality of these Israeli soldiers when they do this rape in front of everyone and in front of the cameras, and they do know that there is cameras in the prison, and yet they did it. What kind of mentality do they have? And then the reaction is this story went away like all other stories, as you also just mentioned, just yesterday's massacre, that everyone you just look at it and it will go away like all other massacres, and this is what we call a genocide. And I think that regardless of the American statement, what we need now for this, what we can call, if we can call, international community to take action, not statements, not condemnation, and not only, expressing their concern about what's going on. Right. We need them really to do something about it. So far, because the United Nations organizations in general, they are, talking about the issues, and but no one is taking any action, and that would encourage Israel to continue, since no one is doing anything to Israel apart from condemnation. They will continue. That's the problem that we are facing now.
Well, Charlotte, as Saad has just said, no one is doing anything, and we've seen that there were some protests from other Zionist settlers. Those who gang raped the prisoner and been detained were not charged and were freed. I mean, what does this say, not only about what is taking place by IOF soldiers, but in general, the overall psyche of the Zionist society?
In many ways, Sidi Timan, this is the true face of Zionism. This is what Zionism looks like. This is the reality of Zionism, which has always been a colonialist, supremacist, fascist ideology that has been based on supremacy and exclusion of Palestinians and Arabs, and based on basically the eradication of indigenous people of the land in order to create a Western settler colonial garrison serving imperialist forces in the region, and has always been willing to take up any measures in order to carry out that aim. And so, when we look back at Al-Nakba of 1948, we also have numerous stories of Palestinian, especially at that time, women and girls who were subjected to horrific sexual assaults at the hands of the Zionists. If we go back to the 1960s and 1970s, sexual assault was routinely used as a form of torture and abuse in order to extract confessions inside the Zionist jails by interrogators. And this was exposed before the United Nations, and there was testimony about it. Resmia Odeh, among others, spoke bravely in exposing this, and years later wound up being deported from the United States, fundamentally because of her role in exposing those kinds of Zionist crimes. And this is part of the theft of the land, the destruction of homes, the burning of olive trees, the sadistic behavior that we've seen displayed on every TikTok of every Zionist soldier. But more than that, it is sponsored by the United States. It is sponsored by Britain. It is sponsored by France. It is sponsored by Germany. It is sponsored by Canada. It is sponsored by every single one of these Western imperialist governments that are funding, supporting, and providing political cover for the Zionist regime.
Well, Saad, there have been discussions even on Israeli TV as well as in the Knesset about the right to sexually assault Palestinian prisoners. And one of the MPs, Hanoch Miliski, said that if the person is Hamas, then everything is legitimate. Your thoughts about that statement?
Hamas, this is not humans. There are some, kind of aliens, apparently, from the Israeli point of view. This is exactly what's going on in this society. This whole society is sick. It is the reflection of that is exactly the speech which was delivered by Netanyahu in front of the Congress. And the American Congress, and all these applauses for him. He said literally, we are the civilized against the uncivilized. So we are the uncivilized. So in such case, and this is, goes with the same lines with the mentality of the colonialist generally. The colonialist, and especially the Western colonialists, and particularly the Europeans, who had a Eurocentric ideology in their heads about, their superiority over the people that they occupied in Africa and in Asia and everywhere else around the world. It was the same claim, the claim that we are the civilized and we are there not for the, to exploit the country, but we are there, to develop these uncivilized people. And that was exactly the same speech of Netanyahu. So the whole Israeli society think in the same way, which is, the colonialist way, that Palestinians are not humans. They are less than us. They are not matching to the Israelis or the Jewish, if you like, from that perspective. So because of that, yes, everything is allowed to any Palestinians. And there are many statements for many Israeli officers and officials. Just last week, it was Smotrich, one of their ministers in the cabinet, who said that killing the Palestinians is something, ethical to kill the Palestinians, regardless whether he Hamas or not. This is even not that matter. Any Palestinian is, they are allowed to kill the Palestinians because Palestinians are less than them. They are unhuman. And remind you also, with the beginning of the war, when the defense minister said, we are going to cut the electricity, the water, and the oil, and everything, and we are dealing with animals. So with this kind of mentality, what did you expect from the Israeli society? Yes, after this raid happened in Sidi Timan, the mob of settlers, they attacked this prison because they don't want these soldiers who commit this crime to be arrested. And when they were arrested and taken to Beit Lid center in the middle of the country, those mob also, they stormed the center, the police center there, to release those prisoners who are, commit a crime in front of a camera, and yet this mob is still, defending them and saying that they should be released. We have many of these cases where the settlers who are supporting soldiers who commit crimes in front of everyone, and yet they get nothing, of sentence, or they will, get a very, very soft sentence most of the time. So it is the mentality of the whole regime, this whole entity. It is, as your guest also said, it's the Zionist. Zionist is based on hatred and discrimination and violence. So this is the basic for Zionism.
Right, some interesting points. What about that, Charlotte? Saad talked about basically this Zionism being an extension of colonialism, especially when we think about the Europeans. It reminds me of what Joseph Borrell said a couple of years ago about the garden, and Europe being the garden and everyone else trying to get in it. Do you think that is part of the reason why the Zionist regime has this 100% support from this Western hegemonic group in general? Or your assessment of that? Because of course, they are not saying a whole lot, even verbally, although they have started to make some comments here and there that it shouldn't take place. But in general, we know that they're in bed with the Zionists.
The Zionist project has always seen itself historically, and the imperialist powers have always seen the Zionist project as essentially an extension of imperialism in the region. Theodore Herzl approached Cecil Rhodes to talk about something colonial in Palestine, and that was the building of the Zionist project there. It was the British imperialist power that issued the Balfour Declaration for the creation of the Zionist project in Palestine, recognizing a so-called Jewish national home to be built there, and then supported, trained, and actually enlisted the Zionists and their paramilitary gangs to fight alongside the British forces in suppressing Palestinian revolt after Palestinian revolt in the 1920s and the 1930s. So, and now, of course, it's the United States that is the lead sponsor of the Zionist project. I mean, just 2 days ago, they said they cleared the release of $3.5 billion in new weapons and bombs and missiles to throw at the Palestinian people and to conduct this genocide in Gaza. So it has always been like a sponsored project of imperialism, first and foremost. And one of the things that's happened recently, and certainly on the 7th of October, is that it was really quite visible that the possibility of a Palestine that was free and liberated of Zionism was not just a dream, but something that could become a reality very soon. And the same thing with a region that was free of imperialism, especially with the rise of the resistance forces and resistance powers in the region. And this is something that the imperialist forces and the Zionist entity do not want to see by any means. And so we are seeing this absolute sick fascist lashing out of this wounded, dying beast, and it is causing tremendous killing and harm and devastation to the Palestinian people. But this is nothing new. Look at the history of France and Algeria or Vietnam. Look at the history of Britain around the world. Look at the history of the United States and its CIA interventions in countries around the world. This has always been a history of devastation and exploitation. And the Zionist project is part and parcel of that entire imperialist agenda for the world.
Yes. Well, Saad, prior to October 7th, there were at least 5,200 Palestinian prisoners Palestinians in prison by the Israeli regime. I want to look at the importance for the Zionist regime in its 76 years since appearing of using imprisonment to try to crush Palestinians. And of course, we've seen how aggressive they have been, even with Palestinians in the West Bank, almost doubling the number of prisoners. I mean, your assessment of the way imprisonment has been and is being used by the regime.
If we are going to talk about the issue of prisoners, Ms. Hashimi, let me just tell you something. Yes, before the 6th of October, 7th of October, there was around 5,500 Palestinian prisoners.
Right.
But over the years, since 1967, we are talking about almost 1 million Palestinian prisoners. Can you imagine that number? 1 million Palestinian prisoners. In an average, if we are talking about what is the number of the Palestinians anyway in the West Bank, Gaza, and Jerusalem after 1967. So that amount of more than 30%, 35% of the total population. Can you imagine and apply that to any country around the world to say 35% of your population are being arrested? The number is huge. The number is unbelievable, because the Israelis, they don't care about, arresting anyone, and they do the arrest as something, whether they are having evidence or not having evidence. Apart from the administrative arrest, which is something, it was created by the British mandate in Palestine, 1945, and the Israeli at that time, or the Jewish organizations at that time, they consider it as a barbarian law. Now they are using the same law, and they continue to use the same law. And this law allows the Israeli to arrest any Palestinian without charges, without interrogation, and without a trial. Only because we might, we think that you might have done something in the past, or you might do something in the future. We have no evidence, but because of that, we can put you for 6 months in prison, and this is renewable once and again and again and again and so on. So we have people who spend 12 years in a row under this administrative arrest. They don't know why they are arrested in the first place. So, and this is one part, apart from the sick treatment, apart from lots of other problems that Palestinian prisoners do face in front of this state. The problem is that the story and the Israeli are, if you like, manipulating the world media regarding this issue. They talk about, a bunch of terrorists that we are dealing with according to the law. According to the law, since Israel is the only democracy in the Middle East. But it's well-known fact that all Palestinians who were arrested were tried in front of a military court, because we are under military occupation. So if your enemy is your judge, so how can you have justice? So there is, for the Palestinians who've been in prison or going on into prison and arresting Palestinians, the Israeli don't care about neither the international law nor for the Geneva Conventions, the second and the third, the third and the fourth Geneva Convention, which deal with the Palestinian or the people under occupation, and they don't care about any kind of law around the world, and they do their own ideas of law. And now we have Ben Gvir, who's the Minister of Internal Security, changing all the laws and allow the Israeli, guards and wardens and even soldiers to do whatever they like with the Palestinian prisoners. And we saw some pictures of Palestinian prisoners, how they went into the prison and how they are after getting out of the prison. The picture is speaking for itself.
Stay with me, Saad. Stay with me, Saad. We're just running out of time here. Charlotte, on Saturday, more than 100 men, women, and kids were killed at a school housing displaced families. And the regime targeted the area, of course, during morning prayer when it knew that more people would be gathering. I mean, what does this say about the regime itself, that it wants to, first of all, target the more densely populated areas, and that the targets are just about always civilians? Although, let me say, they did say that there were Hamas operatives in the school. I guess that would give them the right to kill about 120 men, women, and kids, and many of them could not even be identified because they were cut into pieces so badly.
This horrific massacre is exactly what genocide looks like. It's the targeting of the population as a whole, the targeting of civilians en masse. And we've seen this throughout the entire assault on Gaza. The targets have repeatedly been schools, mosques, churches, residential buildings, refugee camps, hospitals, the mass devastation of the healthcare system, the targeting of public service workers, of police, of people doing aid distribution. I mean, this kind of standard of targeting civilians en masse has been the military strategy of the Zionist regime. They've absolutely failed in attacking the resistance. And it's important to note here that the Zionist regime has absolutely no right to engage in attacks against the Palestinian population. It has no right to be occupying or invading Gaza. It has no right to so-called self-defense against the people it is occupying and colonizing. And the Palestinian resistance is a legitimate and legal armed resistance under international law. And so, no, it would not be legal for them to attack the school, even if it were actually a base of support for the resistance. However, obviously it was not, and was simply a place where civilians were sheltering. And so this entire narrative of it being, of debating who is or is not in the resistance is basically a distraction that the Zionist regime wants to occupy us with, as instead of exposing their crimes and holding them accountable.
Indeed, indeed. Well, Saad, 1 minute I have left. I mean, in your perspective, is the only option for the Palestinian people reliance on the resistance front, or your assessment of that?
Yeah. We tried other ways for 30 years. We tried to say, okay, we want peace, and we tried to say, let's negotiate, and we tried to say we will give up lots of things of our rights. We agreed to give up 78% of our land in return for a minor state in 22% of our land. We agreed even not to discuss seriously the issue of refugees, and yet what did they give us? What did they give us in the peaceful way and means and international law and United Nations? President Mahmoud Abbas went to the United Nations many times and said, please help us. So what? What happened? There isn't any way apart from the resistance. And that's why the support for the resistance now in the West Bank as well as in Gaza Strip is very, very high. Everyone is supporting the Palestinian resistance because this is the only way to deal with such regime.
And on that note, I thank both of you for being with me on this spotlight. Charlotte Case, International Coordinator, Samadoun Palestinian Prisoner Solidarity Network, out of Vancouver. Satnam, Professor of Political Science, Birzad University, out of Ramallah. And thank you, viewers, for being with us on another Spotlight. I'm Marzia Hashemi. Hope to see you right here next time. Goodbye.